Morning, everybody. I'm Emily Bell, Director of the Tow Center for Digital Journalism at Columbia University. This is the latest in our series of webinars held with the ICFJ on the subject of covering COVID and the pandemic. We're very excited to have a great panel with us this morning to discuss the issue that actually is at the center of all of our work, which is the audience and how to connect with the audience, what changes we're seeing in terms of journalism and audience interactions throughout the pandemic. I'm just going to add a little note of caution and housekeeping, which is we're a tiny bit late starting this morning because we had one or two technical difficulties. We're hoping that those are all ironed out and everything will be fine. There's a tiny chance that they will overwhelm us again. If we do that, we've committed to stopping the webinar and rescheduling because we'd rather have time for all of you to listen to these great panelists than necessarily limping through a very sort of spotty session. So that's my moment of warning. And without further ado then, I just wanted to introduce our panel very briefly. They'll all talk much more about their work in their individual organisations in a second. First of all, welcome Nabeelah Shabbir, who is, I believe, are you head of conversations or editor of conversations at the Correspondent? You have a great title.
Yes, I'm the conversation editor at the Correspondent.
Conversation editor. I'd like to think of myself as a conversation editor in my own household, but I'm not very effective at it, unfortunately. Then we have Ebony Reed from the Wall Street Journal, formerly of the Reynolds Journalism Institute and the AP. And since July last year, Ebony has also had an amazingly cool title at the Journal, which is, I think, Chief of New Audiences. Is that right, Ebony?
New Audiences Chief, that's right.
That's fantastic. I love the way that we're going to much more descriptive titles. And then my former colleague and a mentor to many people on this panel, Chris Moran, who is, I believe, I've forgotten your title, Chris. I know you probably best of all, and I think you're head of editorial strategy, but I'm not sure about that at the Guardian.
Head of editorial innovation now.
Head of Editorial Innovation at The Guardian. So welcome, Chris. Thanks very much indeed to everyone for joining us. And last but not least, my partner in non-criminal activities is Julie Posetti, who is the Research Director at the ICFJ. Just to sort of underline, one of the reasons that we're doing these webinars is because the Tow Center and the ICFJ are collaborating on a large-scale survey of newsrooms, international newsrooms across the globe during the pandemic. And Julie, I will ask you a little bit more about that later, if that's okay.
Of course.
Anyway.
And we're winging this and we're going to have fun while picking the brains of these extraordinary people. So everything is good.
Winging is our middle name. So without more ado, I was going to start actually by coming to Chris, because I know that Chris, you've been looking at, so everybody here represents a slightly different type of news organisation. You know, we have small, we have large, we have subscriber only, we have free, we have membership, sort of a blended membership model, a blended membership model. Chris, just describe a little bit about, first of all, your work at The Guardian for people who don't know, and your involvement in thinking through audiences. And then tell us a little bit about how that's been affected by COVID. And what changes you've been making to perhaps your work, but also how it's been impacting the broader newsroom.
Sure thing. So I started in earnest at The Guardian after being a freelance sub-editor as, I guess, the kind of proto-audience editor. And I grew The Guardian's audience team and also built with Graham Tackley and other developers OFAN, which is our real-time data tool. Which aims to keep us really well informed about how our audiences are interacting with our journalism. And since then, I've moved into a more strategy role. So one of the things I've done over the last 3 years is looked at whether we're publishing too much journalism and how we can feed data into that process in a responsible way, which feels pretty relevant to this at the moment right now. But also working more and more with product as well. And on the innovation side. So doing things like adding the kind of social graph timestamp we've added to articles now. When you share them in Facebook, it tells you how old they are, that kind of stuff. So I'm probably the more a generalist in this kind of panel at the moment. I work in the newsroom with editors, but also with product as well. I guess the easiest way for me to go into COVID is probably with my background from audience. I spent this morning talking to Peter Martin, who's our audience editor. The simplest way to say it is that coronavirus is the single biggest story of all time. I don't think there's any other way that you can phrase it. There are lots of different metrics you could use to talk about that. In March and April, we had 2 billion page views on our site. You know, I mean, that sounds big, right? It's difficult for people to really understand how big that is. And one of the things that really struck me and Peter talking about this is for the last few years, we've been looking at a graph of kind of biggest days and audience peaks, which was defined by Brexit and by Trump being elected. You know, and everything else is flattened because of these 2 enormous spikes. Well, this has completely reformed that kind of audience landscape. Those things just look like quite regular spikes now compared to what we've just seen over a sustained period of time. I think the best way of communicating the scale of this is, of our top 100 days of all time by page views, only 19 of them happened before COVID. It's just extraordinary. I've never seen anything like it. And in terms of how that affects a newsroom, I mean, we'll obviously get into it more specifically, but you're talking about how do you deal with the biggest audience of all time and the biggest story of all time when you're working from home at the same time. So ultimately, huge carnage, trying to pack almost like 10 years of change into 10 weeks is the way that I think we've been thinking about it recently. And placing your bets in a situation when you're more and more probably resource constrained as well is really challenging. So that's the main thing. It's enormous and it's difficult.
So Chris, just one of the things that you've been doing very successfully is curating a set of stories that have nothing to do with coronavirus, and just drawing attention to those every day. And I was just going to ask you a little bit, this is a sort of question that I'll come to the other panelists with as well, about those sort of reading patterns, because I believe that as well as sort of the coronavirus completely, you know, altering audiences, there's also the question of sort of interest in other news or other types of content hasn't completely died, has it? It's actually sort of kind of people are searching for other types of content as well.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the other thing that we have to bear in mind as we speak about this right now is it's not as though coronavirus has happened, finished, and then it's a kind of fallow news period. You know, Black Lives Matter, Trump again, you know, roaring back into everybody's consciousness. So, I mean, everything feels unprecedented. I think it's a truism. I think and I think it comes from print, this idea that when there's one story dominating, people aren't interested in anything else. You don't want to publish this on a day when this other story is dominating because it might get missed. Obviously, you need to think about promotional space, but broadly, we're in a situation where people want to read a lot about coronavirus. They want to understand it, and also see their lives reflected in our coverage of it. But equally, they're prepared to scroll further down, say on the homepage, or search in search, or come across things in social which are, to a certain extent, some kind of distraction. I mean, I've actually ended up stopping doing the non-coronavirus daily article, which I loved. It was based on reading time, only because right now there are 3 massive stories all happening at once, and it feels just a bit odd to do it, you know?
Right. So that's a good point at which to come to Ebony. Ebony, we're both based in New York, which feels, as Chris said, there are 3 enormous global stories at the moment, and New York is the epicenter to some extent of all 3 of those in one way or another. It's certainly sort of, you know, kind of feels like the city is a very different place. And the Journal has, you know, kind of a reputation for having a very sort of traditional type of readership. And I know you've sort of written and spoken about sort of changing that. Can you give us a little bit of a flavour of, first of all, what is it that you're doing and what have you been doing in this role? And secondly, you know, what does a moment of really sort of historic change like this mean for very, very traditional brands in news, and how do you go about sort of rethinking not just kind of necessarily the stories that you're putting out, but everything from the ground up?
Mm-hmm. Sure. So first, I want to note that I'm actually based in Kansas City, Missouri, and was before the pandemic. And I work, my team is distributed mostly in New York, but certainly everyone is distributed now. I would say that, you know, we've seen this unprecedented growth. The journal has 3 million subscribers, 2 million of them digital, is bigger than it's ever been. Average active days, one of our key metrics, peaked in mid-April, certainly tied to the pandemic and people's need to find information that was reliable and trustworthy on the topic. Our key strategy has been to provide answers to audience questions and to also couple that with resources. So I believe greatly in service journalism, and I think that that will be one of the factors that will help news organizations really stand out at a time when people have really significant needs, whether it be around understanding the pandemic and health information, or it be figuring out how to get their next job in a complete remote environment. And so a couple things the audience teams have done that I'm working with. We launched 2 microsites during the height of the pandemic. One is WSJ Money and the other is WSJ Jobs. And users can toggle between the two. They're outside the paywall, which is something that is different and new for the Wall Street Journal. And they used questions that we were getting from readers to help us develop the content. So very user-friendly, you know, and based on, that was our strategy that we used. In terms of thinking about this as a historic time, I think, Emily, that it's a time for us to shift how we think about service journalism, what that means to communities, and being able to pair our journalism with resources that can actually be really helpful to readers. So WSJ Jobs provides information for people on how do you interview for a remote job? What do you need to know about virtual etiquette? All things that are really important now, you know, at this time.
So that's actually a good point about the journal's audience, which is that the workplace is something which is going to be altered for pretty much everybody who's, you know, affected by this. Do you know that clearly there is a goal for the journal to have as wide an audience base as possible. Absolutely. You know, how comfortable is it for the newsroom to start to think, you know, perhaps this used to be our type of story and now we need to think about this type of story? Is there, do you see that sort of change happening throughout the organization on different desks?
I do, and I think it was a change that was happening well before when I joined the Journal last summer. You know, people know the Wall Street Journal for its financial news, but, you know, it has long been publishing news and information on culture, sports, you know, features. And just as Chris said, you know, there is a little bit of, I wouldn't call it coronavirus fatigue on news, but people want to read and know about other things. And so it's important to be able to provide information on other topics. I'll also say, you know, as it relates to the protests and coverage of what's happened since the death of George Floyd, you know, we've seen tremendous engagement on those stories as well, you know, from journal readers, not just in the commenting, but also in terms of readership of those stories.
Great, and I'd like to come back to you at some point on and talk to everybody about that relationship which comes through comments and comes through audience voices, etc. as well, because I think that's a really live issue for newsrooms at the moment. But just first of all, I want to come to Nabeelah. Welcome, Nabeelah. I'm just going to check. Where are you at the moment? Are you in London or are you in?
I'm in Amsterdam at the moment.
You're in Amsterdam, right? So we have we have 2 continents well represented here at the moment. 3 if you count Julie. So
I am not a continent.
Nabeelah, tell us a little about it. I know you're taking the daring path of sharing your screen with some material about your work at the Correspondent. So tell us. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that, or just dive into your slides?
I might dive into my slides just
Okay.
as a let's see if it works.
I'm sure it'll be seamless. There we go, seamless.
It works.
Very good.
Yeah. Okay, so how do you cover COVID-19 when you're an unbreaking news platform? I think that was the, oops, hang on, I jumped a bit too far. Okay, yeah. So yeah, this was the main question. How do you cover something which seems to be breaking news? And you know, when we're asking people to pitch us, we're asking, you know, what's left if you don't cover the world as a series of disparate events? You know, you don't center your reporting on any particular geography, and you don't make assumptions about who your audience is, so you don't know what they already know or don't know. So I'd say at the Correspondent, we're reminding ourselves that we explore and explain the foundational structures and developments that, you know, underpin and connect all our lives. Quite a lofty, ambitious goal. And we do that based on the expertise and the fascinations of the correspondents that we have. So the people who write for us currently write about climate, othering, better politics, the first 1,000 days, mental health, and numeracy. And when the pandemic started, we had to remind ourselves, you know, what we were doing our journalism for. And the most important thing that we're doing is really thinking about the 10 principles that, you know, guide us. We launched as a media platform in August 2019, so we're very young still. So as the pandemic happened, I think it's really been an amazing way to sort of lean into that story. And it was a time when we thought we'd, you know, apply our principles to the areas which most needed them. And so, for example, you know, while the pandemic is not something that anyone could have predicted really happening, I mean, you know, the Atlantic, of course, had something a year in advance preparing for it. You know, we couldn't tell that it was systemic in the way it happened, but it was systemic in the consequences it had. And so the idea behind us working on beats is that they're institutional and structural enough to, at some point, show up in the news cycle. So the pandemic was a great chance for us to look at the idea of othering, to have a view from the global south, you know, to look at the connection between climate and the pandemic or mental health. And I hold these transnational chats, which Julie's been a part of a couple of times. And when it came to, you know, racism and inequality, on the suggestion of our members, because we've got 55,000 members, 50,000 of which funded our platform, they, you know, one of them suggested you should be talking to global health experts. So, you know, we invited a bunch of experts onto the platform, and we have these kind of live online events. This one was a really interesting example. These are ones that I hold. You know, a domestic worker from Ecuador talking to an expert from, you know, the US who writes about women's study and security, and actually someone who I discovered thanks to the ICFJ's amazing global health seminars, Mia Milan, who's a journalist in South Africa. And so right at the beginning of the pandemic, we decided the best thing we could offer was a kind of noise cancelling service. You know, we had another chat where we invited epidemiologists and medical experts, and, you know, it's a way for our members to directly talk to these people who are speaking in you know, in media outlets all around the world, including, you know, The Guardian. Another thing we did was the Corona Guide. So, you know, if everybody's trying to find out more information, it's our role to help readers find and filter that information so that they can engage and stay informed without feeling overwhelmed and disheartened, because this is what we were feeling too in our newsroom. And so we coded an interactive where we asked our readers to send in what they were reading. We asked our newsroom to share this around too. And we didn't open the contributions section up on this piece. This is the section that I usually work with, which is that space between where the journalists talk to our members who funded us. And, you know, we invited those reader recommendations via a Google Sheet, and we shared these within our daily newsletters right at the beginning to kind of get a steer on what was happening. And in the process, really, we're sort of recommitting to why we're asking people to become members of our platform. You know, we want to involve them in our discussions. Our correspondents were all hired at the beginning of their beats with the idea that their minds could be changed, that they could learn from the people who join, who write into the Correspondent. So for example, Tanmoy, who's our mental health correspondent based in Delhi, you know, in his weekly newsletter, he was talking to someone from Wuhan, but he was also gathering experts and member experiences from around the world to come up with solutions for, you know, the idea of what can you do about suicide prevention during the pandemic. And, equally, we have these panels where we invite experts. This is something we did with the climate correspondent, and the pieces of the really badly screenshotted stuff that I've put into this slideshow are messages which we've been sending out in our daily newsletters, which we have around 32,000 people signed up for those. But it's a way of reminding them of what we're doing and also ourselves. So one thing that we've looked at in the pandemic, and we're going to continue to look at as a systemic consequence of it, is the influence of technology in our lives. We hired a freelancer and we started a global collaborative project of journalists. We've got a Slack channel where we have other people from around the world who want to be a part of building a database of surveillance during COVID. And so we're working with people on that. And we've started a weekly newsletter. So yeah, I think it's really important that I'm just going to run through all our principles. There's only 10. So, we don't take the view from nowhere. We've doubled down on that and really thought about it. And while the pandemic is going on, of course, I mentioned earlier that there's some fatigue around it. So we also started thinking about that solutions-based aspect of our journalism. What can we do? So we started a new series, which was already in the pipeline, called Fixing the Future, where we invited people to come and offer solutions to different problems. We've hired 2 more guest writers who are looking at the idea of political literacy, how to build back better, and all of these things are quite dynamic and hopefully inspiring for our members to join our journalism and maybe be a part of it too. We talk about the learning curve. And of course, we have writers such as Rutger Bregman, which brings in its own audience. And so, yeah, that's basically what we've been doing. Finally, I just thought I'd end on the note about, putting our journalism before financial gain. We try to, I think the pandemic's really been an opportunity for us to think about reminding people that our model is choose what you pay. So, there might be some people who are in a position where they can pay more or less. You can pay up to $1 to read our journalism. So that's basically a whistle-stop tour through what we do at Correspondent.
That's great, very slickly done and entirely successful. So thanks for that. Just sort of the point that you made there about, you're saying, we put audiences, before profit, etc. Yet, I mean, and this I'm sure is true for The Guardian and also the Journal as well, which is that every business model now is shifting to address the reader much more directly. It feels as though, that actually building that relationship has stopped being a nice to have and is becoming a kind of a must have. And obviously in subscription businesses like the Journal, that's always been the case. So I was just wondering whether, kind of how sustainable, when something like the Correspondent started, it might have felt a little bit sort of different. Are you aware that, you have to keep differentiating and innovating around that? Or do you feel that, you have sort of an engaged enough audience that they're not going to wander off and give all their money to Ebony or to Chris?
Good question. I don't like sharing. No, that's not true. I think what's been really interesting to see is that there has been a membership spike. And so we've done better than we ever have, considering we're not breaking the news. So those are the sort of numbers which speaks for themselves. They're not like absolutely incredible, but there has been, like, the numbers have been rising and we don't see, members signing off. I think it's because we're in our first year still, and we're still trying to figure out what we're doing and still growing. And, of course, we're covering something like surveillance during COVID-19 because the expertise was around or in-house. We could be covering other things better. We don't have health or science reporters, right, to cover something like the pandemic. So I think the fact that we're feeling our way through and trying to stick to, the Correspondent was created thanks to a crowdfunding effort. If we offered principles to our members and we're still getting a chance to deliver on them, I think that's where we're working on it for now. But of course, it would be just amazing if people could afford to keep signing up for journalism. I mean, that's the big test, right? So I think we're very aloft about it all.
Can I ask a question, Nabeelah? Because we work together on Reuters Institute project called the Journalism Innovation Project. And we examined 3 Global South newsrooms to understand how they were putting audiences at the forefront, while at the same time dealing with a lot of toxicity and a lot of other challenges in their own environments. And in our last report, and I'll put a link in the chat shortly, which was about building community, while being under fire, we concluded that it was essential to try and drill down and build relationships that were with audiences that were deeper and narrower, and trust is central to that. But in a time of kind of social distancing, which is how we framed this webinar, you're describing really meaningful relationships being established digitally, even though one of the things we focused on in those reports was the rise of the kind of physical, encounter between journalists and audiences. So can you just speak a bit about how you think you've been able to do what is often called memberful reporting in the context of a member-based news organization? You've given us loads of examples, but what kind of insights are you getting from your members about the way you're responding to this crisis, and how effective has that been?
I think it's really interesting because in that report that we did, we looked at the idea of platform capture and the idea of you're having weaponized attacks in where you're working. And at the Correspondent, you really have to log in to have an opinion, and to log in, you have to pay. I mean, I'm speaking specifically from the conversation element, which is where people come and share their expertise or experience. That's what we're encouraging them to do, to get away from that idea of, social media shouting at each other and being very partisan, trying to find the nuance in between. The way that the correspondents have set up we send a daily newsletter reporting what we publish, but the journalists each have their own audiences as well that they're sending their dispatches to every week. And so we're building up this relationship between people and the journalists, which I think just means that you have lots of smaller audiences and they're all kind of controlled. And everybody who's engaged has engaged because they've subscribed to it, to the newsletter, or to be a part of your, next beat. There are instances where our correspondents might reach out to people who they know something about their topic, such as a neuroscientist coming into our first 1,000-day correspondence articles. And because our correspondents are based in Minnesota or in Lagos or Delhi or Cairo or Naples at the moment, if there's somebody from Sydney who's wrote into them, it's actually in their interest to develop that conversation and talk further with them and see whether they can take it through any further. So it's a bit like that open notebook idea of journalism and moving along with your audiences. And of course, the membership program, I guess, we also looked at that at the Daily Maverick in South Africa. It did help them stay a bit more protected. So it feels like a little bubble, and the personalization, I think, is really key. Taking the view from nowhere. And of course, the events, we would have hoped at this stage that we were starting to have an event in Buenos Aires, in Lagos, in Delhi. And of course, now that's all been sort of shrunk. I think one big concern with the pandemic in journalism is that I think with journalists everywhere, they cannot continue on their journeys of reporting as they would have been. Their beats have very much changed according to that, but it might just be appropriate for the time that we're all living in now.
I wanted to pick up on something that you said then, Nabeelah, and ask Ebony and Chris about this as well, which I've been thinking about a lot. Partly to do, I think, with the form of the platforms that people are getting news from, and just partly because of the way that journalism is evolving. This idea of the connection happening between the individual journalist rather than the news brands feels to me like we've been talking about it for a long time, but actually it's sort of reached, if you like, a critical mass or a tipping point. And we see things like, the New York Times having a daily anchor for its daily newsletter. We see that sort of personalization of voice. Ebony, is that something, when you're working in a well-known, extremely well sort of trusted brand like the Journal, how are you balancing or thinking about that dynamic between individual journalists and the Journal as a brand?
Absolutely. So the individual journalists are part of the Wall Street Journal's brand because they do the reporting to produce the news that people connect with. So I wouldn't see it as like either or, but sort of that if we had like a Venn diagram, we'd have a big circle of the brand, and then we would put a circle inside of it, and the journalists would be part of that brand. So I work on the Women in newsletter, and twice a month, I write that welcome with my colleague, Nikki Waller. I've been working on the strategy and also will be working on the production of a newsletter that we're launching this Thursday. And one of my colleagues, JJ McCory, who's on the Young Audiences team, will be the writer. He'll be the anchor. So his picture will be on the Diversity in Business newsletter, and it will focus on issues in the workplace that relate to diversity and inclusion. And so, we're thinking about that as we're developing new news experiences. I wanted to also mention something else, Emily, as we were thinking about the coronavirus cohort, as we sometimes call them at the Journal. And I just wanted to note that the Wall Street Journal was one of the first news organizations to open its stories on the coronavirus for all to read, regardless of subscription status as a public service. And then, of course, like many news organizations, we had a ribbon at the top that tied in a lot of our offerings, which included information in Spanish. I think one of the things that it's really important that the membership team does when new members come to us, they were surveying them. They were finding out, what topics are important to them. And I think that kind of internal work at news organizations is important when we see an influx of members to really understand what's important to them, compare that to our current audience readership, and then figure out moving forward what offerings should be new and different based off of the various audiences.
That's super interesting. And I was going to ask you actually that, is that something because, as you say, it sort of feels like a good thing to do in terms of, public service. Is that type of innovation making you rethink a little bit, how necessarily sort of paywalls work? So in other words, do you think that there are more lessons for recruitment beyond kind of an unusual news story?
Well, the team that I work on, Digital Experience and Strategy, DXS, we don't control the paywall at the Wall Street Journal. But and the Journal has a flexible, dynamic paywall that adjusts bases on like how many times you come to a site. It'll recognize you, and then you'll get different opportunities for membership. What I would say is I do think we're thinking about what information for certain audiences we should put outside the paywall to introduce new groups to the Journal. So then we have an opportunity to bring them along. I think of it sort of as like going to a party, if someone invites you to a party, but if you don't know anything about the people that are having the party, you probably won't want to come. And so I think about that sometimes too, as we're thinking about how to recruit and introduce new audiences to the Journal.
Right. I find that if you know who's going to a party, sometimes you don't want to go either. But Chris, on that point about just sort of rewinding a little bit to the point about the balance between individuals or products that kind of suit individual voices like newsletters, podcasts, etc. And also this sort of place that Ebony just touched on how kind of audience development intersects really closely with innovation, which is not something perhaps that we thought about much in the past, or nearly didn't think about nearly enough in the past. So I wonder if you could just sort of tackle each of those.
Yeah, I'm not as interested in that whole anchor thing as possibly everybody else is, only because I think it's just a constant. I don't think it's a new thing. There are emails going back years and years and years which have been full of personality written by an individual. I think the difference with the New York Times is they've thrown a very specific person, a very heavyweight person at that problem, which makes it interesting. And of course, we are interested in that space depending on the product, as you say, Today in Focus. Wherever we have a product which feels like it requires a kind of journalistic personality and that kind of touch to it, obviously we're open to that. I mean, I think in terms of coronavirus, I'm much more interested in terms of hearing the audience. I think it's more interesting the other way, as in how do we hear from them and how does it inform our journalism? And I think that's one of the biggest things about coronavirus is this is the story. We've long had a real commitment to community journalism, to putting out call outs, but this is the one where I think everything made sense, and it's absolutely become much more cemented within the newsroom. because of the people who are running our community journalism teams, but also the editors who are realizing that this is the kind of key which allows us to get into things like diversity, making people believe that we're hearing their voice and also reflecting it back at them. I think that's the bit of it that excites me and interests me most in terms of audience and speaking to them or hearing from them.
Chris, can I ask you how you relate? Oh, sorry, go on.
No, you.
I thought you'd finished. I'm really interested to know how you also seg that with trust, the question of trust. And, you know, I know many journalists and journalism academics and other scholars are very much focused on this question of trust as a key issue to ensure that audiences continue to come to our party.
Absolutely.
So how are you trying to use this story or respond to this story, this series of stories, these mega stories, in new ways that help you to advance the trust that your audience has in The Guardian as a brand?
So I think there's a lot of answers to that question because it cuts across so much, right? It's partly about the tone that you're taking and your general journalistic approach to this topic, right? And that's in your hands. We're going to do this responsibly. We're going to try and think about what language we use around it. We're going to try and leave some space for hope. Nabeelah was talking about that. That's something that Kathina has talked about a huge amount and feels particularly essential here. I think
that solutions idea, is that?
Well, but also just having a really concrete idea of how you are covering the story and what that looks like in totality. That also goes down to how many stories are you doing about this? How as well are you developing your front page so that you can accommodate a story and walk people through a story like this? So in terms of trust, community journalism, just as a basic act in terms of reaching out to people and then doing the journalism which reflects back at them is huge. We see enormous audiences to pieces of journalism generated by that, but also crucially engagement as in time spent with those pieces. But the flip side of that is on the service side, because people do want to hear, you know, stories that reflect themselves, but they also do want us to help them understand this story. You know, and that's got a bit less cool at various times in the conversation around community, that kind of like patrician element. Yes. But today, the 4 biggest stories now in the history of The Guardian are all explainers. All of them are explainers. And
which 4 are they, Chris?
3. I'm pretty sure they all relate to coronavirus. The top one is the biggest, most basic early coronavirus piece that we've been updating ever since. One of the things that's really struck us about that is we're not necessarily set up to deal with that kind of long tail explainer piece of content. You know, I mean, everybody really has been in the same boat of going, this story has happened. Let's write an explainer which relates specifically to this period of time. 3 weeks later, as that story develops, you tend to write a new one, you know, and you leave this kind of trail behind you. We're getting into that now. We started looking at explainers and using atomic snippets to embed within articles a couple of years ago. We were a bit ahead of the game. But it really interests me that you've got those 2 sides of it, you know, community, absolutely listening to your audience, reflecting them, and then us helping them understand this incredibly complicated story that's moving all the time. I think the other thing that we've really focused on as well is live. It's always been part of our DNA, but we made a very early decision that we wanted to run 4 live blogs, a UK one, an Australia one, an America one, and a global one as well. Now, we obviously reserve the right, as this story develops, to not do one of those on a given day or shut one down permanently. But that's been absolutely huge for us as well.
I have to say that's actually how I was keeping up to date. I tried, you know, I was listening to live radio and I was searching very many other major news brands, but frankly, The Guardian eclipsed all of those in terms of, this is not, I'm not paid by The Guardian, but my experience.
I wish I could take personal
my experience as an audience member was just that it was up to date. And you told me when you were planning to close the blog and send me somewhere else, which often didn't happen.
We have a ton of actually really good questions in the Q&A, and if you have a question, do put it into the Q&A. I'm going to sort of go past them through them in reverse order. So Jodie Ginsburg, hi Jodie, great to have you on here.
Hey.
Saying the panel all work with large news organisations. Not sure that's true of Nabeelah. I don't know how big the Correspondent is, but it's still pretty tiny. How do they think, and I think this is a great question, how do they think their organisations can work with and help support local and community news outlets? And what local news organisations can learn from them in terms of financial survival and vice versa. I would say on these webinars that we've had, one of the most consistent recurring themes is how do we also work with each other within the community of journalism, and particularly how do we think about you know, supporting a network of people who we might have considered to be our competitors or not even really thought about. So I don't know if anybody wants to tackle that. As I say, sort of it's possibly one for Chris and for Ebony first off, but perhaps Nabeelah, if you're from a smaller news organisation, also are able to pass on any insights to other smaller newsrooms who always want to know what are the one or two things that we could be doing.
Well, I just have one thing to say, which is that obviously we're transnational as an organization. There's about 15 of us in total, so we're really small. But I've been in conversations with newsrooms in Romania, in Bulgaria, and like last week, El Salvador, because they're interested in that idea of conversation or that idea of a membership model. So even though we're not necessarily working with local newsrooms where we are, I mean, we're trying to be everywhere, but we stay in discussion with people who are trying to do something similar because we find it really fascinating. The news organization in El Salvador wants to have a place where people do not have partisan ideas about what's happening in their country. You know, that to me is fascinating. So it's useful to share some of the principles of how we're working and see if it can work for them.
We've got another question here, unless Ebony, you would like to respond to that as well.
I just wanted to say that in my time at the AP, you know, one of the things that, you know, we do when I was at the Associated Press, and they still do it, is they connect newsrooms across the country. And I definitely think that there are opportunities to do that in my work at the Journal as I'm growing new audiences. So if there is someone that's interested in talking more and brainstorming, you know, I would welcome, you know, my DMs are open, you know, on Twitter. And I do like what Chris said earlier about us thinking about the readers and the questions that they give us. We've been doing a lot of that at the Journal. And one of the things I've also done is worked with an organization. It's the National Bar Association, the largest group of Black legal professionals. And I went to them at the height of the pandemic and said, you know, really simple, low tech, you know, here's a Google form. I'd love to get your questions each week that you don't see included in our coverage. And I'll come back to you with the story examples where it's happened. And if it hasn't, I'll funnel that into our newsroom. And that's been a really helpful model for us in terms of like beginning to grow community and outreach, you know, with organizations.
That's fascinating. So you're actually targeting specific groups of experts, almost in the way that we would go to sources, but you're targeting them with a view to extracting their questions so you can address them through your journalism.
Absolutely.
I wanted just to sort of pick a question from higher up the thread from Fadi Ramsey, who asked, how far has COVID-19 changed the editorial product? Now we see more data visualizations, interactive dashboards, etc. What else has COVID-19 added here? I think this is a really good, interesting question, because for those of us who were toiling, as Chris will know, toiling away, as I did many years ago at The Guardian, about going, data is a great thing, we should have more of that. And, you know, audiences, we should have more comments and articles. Nobody thanked me very much for that one. But these moments of sort of innovation, what are the things that you guys think will actually stick in your newsrooms that are different from what you were doing before, or perhaps where you'll change emphasis in terms of the actual sort of products that you put out? Does anyone want to field that?
I think absolutely data and visualization of data is a crucial one. I think one of the interesting things about this story, though, is that while it feels like a data story, it often isn't, because the data isn't terribly trustworthy or is incredibly complex and difficult to understand and doesn't lend itself to the kind of simplicity which most people are looking for in that graph of daily deaths or what have you. I mean, I'll be honest, I don't think that anything particularly unexpected has happened in terms of what we've been doing. But I think what it's done is accentuated, it's magnified everything. Do you know what I mean? Like doubling down on explaining, doubling down on community. None of these things are particularly new, but I think we've accelerated our process. We've done about 10 years of work in about 10 weeks around those things. That's my personal feeling. I think one thing we haven't really talked about is, from our side, one thing we did was, how do we curate the front? Our digital editors, that is really hard. It's been really tough. And we watch our commissioning quite carefully. We've been very careful and thoughtful, hopefully, about the volume of COVID in particular we've been doing, but it presents a massive problem there. And I think there's been some interesting innovation there. I'd call out the New York Times's little widget that follows you around constantly around COVID stuff, which says, and here's the explainer, and here's the live blog, stuff like that. I think it's not terribly flashy, but it's really fundamentally useful to people.
Mm-hmm.
And journalism as service. Sorry, go on, Ebony.
I was just going to mention that I think some of our formats have adjusted during COVID. So like one of the things that the Journal did, we were doing these Q&As and they started getting really long. And the innovation team created a format, the Flexicle, where it's almost like, it's like a drop down. So you're able to see more of the questions, scan what information you want to know, click and expands and read what you want. So I think those kind of formats will stay with us. We were just starting to get our feedback form, which is sort of our version of polling our audience, asking questions of the audience, attaching it as an inset to stories off the ground before the pandemic hit. And I think we've seen such great response. I remember, when we crossed like 20,000 questions, and it wasn't that like early into the pandemic when that happened. And I remember thinking, wow, this format is like here to stay. And I was just talking with a reporter yesterday who was asking me, can we get the feedback form on her stories, because like she's really interested. So I think that format of audience engagement is here to stay.
I think that's super interesting from a researcher point of view, and this is a conversation I was having with an academic called Nate Matthias up at Cornell. We were both saying how much we would love to know, and he's particularly sort of worked on this, kind of how stories also change how people think about something, particularly sort of, around COVID, it's been more measurable. Does it change your behavior, etc.? So if any of you want to donate your content management systems to that kind of survey, I know a really skilled academic, not me, but it's those sorts of things which I think are so interesting, that we actually have a moment where we can learn and adjust what we do and really think about, does what we do really affect people? I think that's sort of one of the things where I think we know it does, sort of, kind of intrinsically, but the data and the evidence for that is not always that easy to gather.
Can I just make a point here, Emily, and maybe people can respond to this before we take another question. We haven't yet addressed the issues of the platforms. And they're significant players, of course, in distribution and engagement. And we've spent the past 10 years or so really focused on Facebook and Twitter and other, name your platform, insert each new update. What has your experience been of your habits regarding platform distribution and engagement? And because what I'm hearing, and this is just a kind of, instant reaction, is that you're much more focused on deeper relationships with audiences that are almost off platform, on your own platform, rather than the kinds of engagement that we chased for a decade via the social networks. So who wants to go first with that one?
I'll happily dive in on that. I think, yes, I think it's been a long time since anybody's been hard chasing, likes on Facebook as some kind of metric that you pay any attention to. And I'm really glad. We never really did. We've always been interested in those platforms as a way of referring people back to our site and developing a long-term relationship with them. Obviously that can be tricky with certain platforms, but which just aren't built to do that. Instagram has been very interesting over the course of this pandemic. It's been really important, and we proceed with that because we feel we can do great journalism there, and we can reach an interesting demographic too. I think in terms of engaged audiences, search is extremely useful here in terms of delivering engaged audiences around very specific search terms. There's nothing much more engaged than somebody who's looking for something particular and then find something relevant on your site. Yeah. So that's good. One of the things that's really interested me about this period is watching Google struggle with sheer volume. We've looked at the coronavirus search results page very carefully for obvious reasons over the past few months, and it looks to me like they're struggling there in terms of just coping with everything, with every angle. I think they've generally done quite a good job, but in terms of thinking about local news organizations, I think that's one thing that everybody should be focused on is Google serving those people and delivering good regional results on these big topics. At the moment, it's a bit of a mess. We went through an early period where lots of UK readers were being served CNN and New York Times articles.
Yeah.
And then more recently, a kind of random splodge of local journalism, which isn't going to help the local journalism outfits, you know, unless it's really targeted at the people who are looking for that kind of journalism. Yeah.
What
Sorry,
about you? No, it's fine. And I want to hear more about your Instagram strategy and so on. But maybe Ebony, you can. I don't know if you have an Instagram strategy that you've found to be equally important. I know you have a different kind of audience profile, but what's your response to that?
Well, I do think that social has its place. And I think it can help us in terms of like growing community. I wouldn't necessarily say that we're chasing likes at all, but you know, we recently launched a series of, we call them community conversations around the topics that are important in communities related to what sparked the protests across the country. So we did our first one 2 weeks ago that I hosted on policing during protest. We have one this Thursday about talking race at work. And we are simulcasting it on Twitter to grow our reach so more people will see the conversation. So I do think that there is like a purpose for social, but I see it as sort of like something we do in tandem with like really focusing on our own platforms and what that experience will be.
Okay.
I thought it was interesting actually that reading the Reuters Institute report on you know, sort of digital news consumption habits last week, something I've written about in the Tow Center newsletter this week, is just that how the trust metrics have shifted and the platforms, as Chris said, are really struggling. And I know a number of us have been to those sort of finger waggy conferences organized by platforms where they tell us that journalism's trust is, you know, in tatters and failing, and what are we going to do about it and how can they help us? I feel like that we need to have that conversation in reverse now.
Yeah.
But it's I thought it's a great point, Julie, to ask, you know, what does this mean? And it comes back actually to a point that Ebony made earlier, just about sort of, you know, kind of investing in those conversations sort of on platform. And again, a sort of a question for the panel. You know, we went through a full cycle of inviting audiences onto platforms, onto our own platforms, not really understanding how to moderate or interact or make valuable those relationships. Everybody then, well, not everybody, but a lot of people then outsource those relationships to third-party platforms. Are we going to see a complete reversal of that now? So as Chris said, we know it's a long time since we've chased likes on Facebook. Is the idea of rebuilding a sort of a platform for our audiences something that we should all be investing much more money in now?
Which is exactly what Rappler is doing in the Philippines, of course. That's been their response to the problems with Facebook. Sorry, just to give a practical example.
Yeah.
Yeah, I hope that's something that we see. I mean, the Journal had the project Elevated Discourse that started before I joined, where it completely changed its structure around moderators. You know, the Journal had some part-time you know, staffers and contractors moderating, and you know, we are now a team of 7 if you include me as an occasional moderator in between my other work with that team. And we have community standards. Anyone can go on the site and see them. They're attached before you can comment on a story. Commenting is open to members, and that team, the Audience Voices team, works hard to hold the community standard. And it's been really challenging because the volume that we've seen since the coronavirus, then compounded by the protests, you know, to be able to do that moderation, even with an AI filter, but they are, you know, working really hard on it. So I hope that we'll see other news organizations follow suit, because I think, you know, that's a place where people develop, quite frankly, impressions about us. When they come to the site and you read those comments, and if we look at that as an engagement metric of reading the comments, you know, it's important that we're communicating trust and also, you know, standards, you know, to the readers and the audiences that see those comments and not just participate in them.
Here's a question which relates to that, which I know that certainly I've spoken to Chris about quite a bit in the past, which is how does, and it may seem obvious, but I don't think it is obvious to everyone, which is how does the rise in digital engagement actually convert into monetization? Because that's been a link that I think we're all we're all looking for. Nabeelah, do you know, obviously you have a slightly different model, but that idea of how engaged is your audience, how much money do you make, are those intrinsically linked?
I'm smiling because data is kept away from me as the conversation editor. I never get to see metrics or anything happening because of one of our principles, which is that we don't collect data. So it's been a very interesting, frustrating time for me because I only have to focus on the journalism and who's coming back, and I might be able to recognize names, but there's no way I can keep a track of that or know how much a member might have donated.
Right.
So yeah, for me, this remains a mystery.
I was going to say super interesting because you're now in a little kind of subset of news organisations. I think of two, along with the markup, who say we don't collect data on people. So again, we focus on the journalism and what we think is the right thing to do without necessarily. So Chris is looking very perplexed at that.
Are you okay, Chris?
Imagining, guessing every day. But yes, that that engagement and monetization. You know, Ebony, you work in a very hard-headed financial organisation, and yet, you know, the journal is sort of pushing ahead on, you know, the engagement front. So do you have data, or is it just sort of still working on instinct that it's a good thing to do, therefore it adds overall to the likelihood that people will subscribe?
Well, you know, a large percentage of the subscribers that came to the journal since the pandemic hit are digital subscribers. So, you know, I think that that's, you know, something that we're thinking about. Certainly my colleagues that work on the business side and membership, you know, have their hands in their work, you know, in that much more on a daily basis. But occasionally some of that data does come my way, and I do, and my colleagues do think about it and look at it as we're developing and thinking through, you know, our strategies.
There's one more question too, Emily, that might be useful, and I might fling it back to you, Nabeelah. It's from one of our international participants, and of course these webinars are a feature of ICFJ's Global Health Crisis Reporting Forum, which is important but a mouthful, where journalists from all around the world come together and collaborate on understanding this story and sharing their journalism. And so Sareb Zavaleta says that we're tired of hearing news only about the virus and the racism problem. Is that all that's left? And he or she, I'm sorry, I don't know, officially, sorry, goes on to say, TV news is stuck on the same topics. We want to hear what's going on around the world, which gets back to that question that we started with earlier around what you can't report when you have three mega stories that are kind of all interconnected in the West, at least. How do we try and focus in a meaningful way on the very many other stories that continue to bubble and boil that allows us to serve our audiences beyond these three stories? Nabeelah, maybe you want to start, because you're clearly trying to do that from the position of an organization built around these deep verticals, thematic verticals.
This is why I swiveled around my chair and looked very interestingly at the editor-in-chief and was like, coronavirus, what are you going to do now? We don't have a health or a science correspondent. So what does this mean for us? Do we pretend it's not happening because it's, you know, it's breaking news or whatever? And he very painstakingly explained to me that, you know, because we're trying to uncover systemic issues that are happening around the world, we are going to keep focusing on those things that we promised our members who crowdfunded our organization, that we're going to keep doing that. We're going to keep talking about climate, keep talking about othering. And of course, those things can be expanded to include a lot of other topics. Climate, we're now expanding it to talk about justice, of course, better politics, the first 1,000 days of a child. We're sticking with what we know and focusing on that path. In the hopes that we don't cover events, because this is how, I guess, the news media gets its, you know, it focuses on what's happening every day, right? If we look at what's happening beneath that, maybe then the story will come back to us. When we started our platform in August, we hired an everyday colonialism correspondent who wrote about statues and street names. Well, that's all come back into the news now. But at the time it felt a bit like, why are we talking about this? But it is interesting, and you know, it's interesting that somehow the news comes back to you rather than you setting the news, and maybe this will change the trend. That's the ambition, anyway.
Fascinating.
I don't know whether it's, because of the work I've done on content reduction and thinking about commissioning in general, we're set up well at The Guardian. We're in a we have weekly and daily routines by which commissioning desk and desk editors are looking at what their output is. And we've been focusing very, very carefully on everything that is coronavirus and everything that is not in the first instance. I think one thing that you have to recognize is, and sometimes we worry too much about this, there's a news ecosystem. You're not the only people doing it. So choose what you want to do. You know, I think you can't do everything, and you have to trust that places like The Correspondent are going to be delving, you know, deeply into really interesting things, sometimes before they even become news. But I think that's quite important, because otherwise you end up attempting to do everything. It is really hard though. I mean, just balancing covering this stuff, when, especially in the new working conditions, everyone feels a sense of massive urgency as well. It's really hard. But I think there can also be category errors here. Coronavirus isn't just a big story, it is a story about everything. I mean, it really is. And so to a certain extent, it would be insane if we weren't really focused on most of what we're writing about now in, say, business and finance on that stuff.
Right.
So I think what you do is you make sure you know what you look like to the outside world. And for me, that involves data. And so you look at what you're publishing, look at how people are reading it, and then over the top of that, you have your natural editorial instincts about whether you feel that is right or wrong, and constantly monitor it.
I think one of the ways that news organizations can balance both is when we decide to cover something that's outside of the big story, and the Journal has been doing this as well, is breaking exclusives. Because then, you know, people then remember, oh, that great story, you know, last week the Journal had excerpts from John Bolton's book. And so, you know, I think that is like a way to manage that if you have limited, you know, resources and have to make choices.
I think those are excellent points. We have a few more minutes left, and one thing we haven't talked about, but I'd love to hear from everybody on the panel about is, you know, we've talked about the enormity of the story, and we've talked about how it's changing everything, and particularly changing the way that we work, both in good ways and bad ways, because it's very restrictive of our access. If we are to think ahead, if we're going to think about the next 1, 2, 3 years, you're all in very forward-facing roles or thinking about these things in the future. What are the things that you would really like to see change? What are the things? What is your one wish if you could have something that would change, which you think would make a real difference, not just to your newsroom, but to journalism in the future? Where would you look? Everybody's avoiding eye contact on the camera. Nabeelah broke it first, so I'm coming to her first, and she's completely disappeared. I'm struggling.
Oh my.
Yes.
Well, what a great question to end on. I'm a bit narrow-minded in this, because my job is so random. I'm a conversation editor, and that's not got a precedent. I mean, Dear Correspondent, who's our sister Dutch site, came up with it first. So I honestly feel like when it comes to media, if there could be a conversation where we could agree to disagree and share our expertise and our experience, and not just yell whatever we think is right about a topic, I feel like that would be really interesting. That's something which I'm moving towards when it comes to journalism, at least.
Good answer. Ebony.
I expect to see even more personalization, because people have more choices. And as Chris said, you know, we're not the only organization offering information and news, so I expect to see that. One thing I haven't seen that I thought I would see faster adoption of, I remember the first time I put on AR goggles, and I thought, oh, this is like so awesome. Like I could see like in 2 years, everyone will be doing this. I haven't seen the kind of adoption yet of that. And I do wonder, especially with, you know, people being at home and changing their habits, you know, with the virus, I wonder if in a year or so we'll see more or any further adoption of that technology as an integration with journalism.
That's a really interesting point, as you say. You know, kind of VRA or felt like one of those. Mind you, it could be like podcasts and newsletters, which we all did in 2004, 2005, and people were like, no, you know, forget those. There's no future.
They're analog, yeah.
They're analog. So maybe in about 10 years' time, we'll all be back into AR. Chris, time has come for you to stop staring out the window.
Really, really classic avoidance strategy, though.
Worked at school. Well, I mean, the thing that I would like to see change the most, and the thing that's most urgent, is I would like the news industry to crack business models which allow not just one large player, but multiple people to have a stable environment in which to do journalism. I mean, that sounds idiotic, but it's the crucial thing. It would, you know, sort so many other problems out. In terms of innovation, what I would like most to see, and what I'm most interested in, is less of us as an industry taking our innovation cues from platforms and major tech players. I'm actually not that interested in personalization in some ways. There is an argument that we don't have to do it. And that the reason we think we need to do it is because Facebook does it, and then they have money, and so on and so forth. I think what I want to see is really, really strong editorial ideas that we can then turn into interesting products and features. Because that's the thing that we have in our corner compared to Facebook. I mean, look what happens when Facebook tries to deal with journalistic concepts. It's a disaster area, and a social one as well as everything else. So that's what I want to see. We should be looking inwards and at our audience to try and find things we need to solve and ways of telling stories in interesting ways.
Can I answer this one too, Emily?
Sure.
Just picking up on what, and I'm not running a newsroom or even in a senior role in a newsroom anymore, but looking at this, and I'll reflect on our survey data for a bit too, because I think that's important to share with our community as we continue our study. But it goes exactly to what Chris is saying, that for me, we're starting to see that full circle that you described, the expertise that exists within editorial context. We used to be ashamed of kind of talking about editorial curation, and you know, and speaking down to an audience was often conflated with expertise around how to verify and sort and present information. And I'm reflecting on this experience, this extraordinary experience of the pandemic. It's taken me back to the beginning of my journalism career, which was in public radio in Australia. And in a public broadcasting context in a country that was annually ravaged by bushfires, the experience of incredible trust that came to a public broadcaster as the voice that provided guidance, public safety information, that also critiqued the politics around responses and so on. That feels to me a bit like what we're experiencing now. And I'm looking from the outside in. So for me, the question of trust is important, but it's disconnected from the platforms as many of you are describing here. And I just have one innovation idea that I have been itching to develop for about a decade. Can somebody please come up with scratch and sniff components for stories? Because at the moment I am missing the smell. I am missing the smell of eucalyptus, and I am missing the smell of the sea, and I want to feel connected to those things. So I don't know, you know, the people with the most money in this group are probably the Wall Street Journal and the Guardian. There you are, my idea, go patent it.
There we go. So on Julie's plea for more smell-o-vision, as we used to call it, I've only got 2 bits of housekeeping left to go, and we're perfectly on time. One of it, which is to say thank you so much to all of you for making time today, and thank your teams and your newsrooms for the work that they do. It's making a difference every day. The second thing is to say, if you haven't taken the survey, it's out there. There's a link in the chat at the moment. We'll be posting the link again on our social accounts. Do the survey. We've got, Julie, how many respondents? 2,000?
We've got over 2,000. I haven't checked today. The English language survey was supposed to close yesterday, but we decided to keep it open for a few more days, partly because of illness on the team, which meant that we couldn't get access to the English language data, but also because we have our webinar today and others this week. We wanted to give people one last chance. So here's your opportunity to help us help you. So please go and do it.
It really is providing some great sort of granular, in-depth insights.
Absolutely.
There's opportunity there. It's not just a kind of yes, no, it's you opportunity there to tell us really what's happening in your newsroom and what's happening to you as journalists in the field. So with that, thank you very much indeed for joining us, you, the audience. This is about you. Thank you, the panelists. Thank you, ICFJ.
And one housekeeping announcement from me too, Emily. Sorry, before you hit the go away now.
Housekeeping.
I have one more housekeeping thing, which is from ICFJ, and this is actually a really important one. This Global Health Crisis Reporting Forum with IJNet, which is a project of ours, has a webinar on Thursday about reporting on gender-based violence in the context of COVID-19, which I think is a really big challenge and a really important theme to discuss. So that's at 9 a.m. Eastern, which is 2 p.m. in the UK. So I just wanted to encourage people. It's not part of our journalism and the pandemic project, but it's a part of the broader work we're doing. And I think that's a really vital conversation.
Thanks very much, Julie. Thanks very much, everybody. Stay safe and have a good week. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.